Hello there. My name is Marissa Pilger-Sir, and I'm a research assistant and pre-doctoral intern at the Center on Teaching and Learning at the University of Oregon, where I serve on the National Center for Improving Literacy's Professional Development and Technical Assistance team. Today I'll be presenting on supporting students with dyslexia in special education. Before we get started, take a moment to reflect on your current understanding of how schools support students with dyslexia, and specifically how special education laws inform the supports that schools provide. In today's session, you'll walk away with an understanding of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, as well as its intended purposes. You'll develop an understanding of definitions for key terminology within IDEA, and you'll learn about some key misconceptions related to the role of special education for supporting students with dyslexia in schools. First, let's talk about the Individuals with Disabilities Act, also known as IDEA. IDEA is a federal law that governs how states provide special education supports to students with disabilities in schools. IDEA ensures that all schools meet minimum requirements to support the needs of students with disabilities. States adopt their own special education laws that at minimum meet the requirements of IDEA, but that also often provide more specific or comprehensive recommendations and requirements for schools. IDEA was last reauthorized by Congress in 2004. The law was first enacted by Congress in 1975, when it was called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. Congress enacted the law after a large-scale investigation showed that millions of students with disabilities were not receiving an appropriate education, with 1.75 million children with disabilities receiving no education at all. The law was intended to establish a process for ensuring that schools were held accountable for providing education services to all students with disabilities. Thus, the focus of the law was on making sure that students with disabilities had access to education, and a system of checks and balances to ensure that the rights of students with disabilities and their parents were protected. Let's take a closer look at what exactly IDEA means by each of these purposes by breaking down some of the language in this law. First of all, IDEA is intended to provide access to education to children with disabilities. When IDEA talks about children with disabilities, it means children who have one of 13 different disabilities identified by the law. Students with dyslexia are considered by IDEA to have a specific learning disability, which is one of the 13 disability categories. To count as a child with a disability, not only does a child need to have one of these disabilities, they also need to demonstrate that because of their disability, they are in need of special education and related services. In other words, they need to have educational needs that can't be met by general education alone. IDEA also mentions that students with disabilities are entitled to free, appropriate public education. This statement gets at the issue of student access to public education. The education these students receive should be provided at public expense, must meet state standards, and must meet the needs of an individualized education plan that has been developed specifically for the student. Perhaps the most widely debated part of this terminology is what it means for public education to be appropriate for students with disabilities. This issue has been argued ever since the enactment of the law, and has even been taken to the Supreme Court. A Supreme Court ruling in 1982 in a case called Board of Education v. Rowley provides some clarification around what is appropriate for these students. In response to this case, the Supreme Court stated that an appropriate education is one that enables the child to achieve passing marks and advance from grade to grade, In other words, the court specified that IDEA is intended to provide a basic floor of opportunity for students, which gives them access to instruction that provides educational benefit. These students are not necessarily entitled to the best education or an education that maximizes their potential. IDEA also specifies that schools must provide instruction that meets the unique needs of students with disabilities and that prepares them for further education, employment, and independent living. To do this, schools must provide specially designed instruction and related services to students with disabilities who have educational need. This instruction is intended to help these students gain access to the general curriculum. Specially designed instruction is instruction tailored to meet students' individual needs. For example, a 5th grade student who has substantial difficulties sounding out words may need specially designed instruction in decoding and word reading skills to help them access grade-level texts. Related services or any other services necessary to help students with disabilities benefit from instruction. For instance, the same 5th grade student may also need access to assistive technology, such as audiobooks and speech-to-text software, so that they can more easily access grade-level social studies and science assignments that involve reading or writing. Special education encompasses a range of services, which may occur across different settings, from one-on-one intensive academic remediation in a special education classroom to push-in academic supports in the general education classroom. Regardless of how these services are provided, the goal is to help students achieve long-term goals, such as attaining further education or a job, and to be able to live independently. We provide students with these supports in the least restrictive environment to ensure they have access to their general education classroom to the maximum extent possible. IDEA also provides protections for students with disabilities and their parents. These protections are provided through what is known as procedural safeguards that dictate the rights of students with disabilities and their parents. For example, parents of students with disabilities have the right to participate in meetings and help make decisions related to their child's special education eligibility, evaluation, or educational placement. Parents also have the right to be notified about any changes to their child's services, and to a legal process for resolving any disputes related to their child's access to free, appropriate public education. Finally, IDEA defines what it means to have a specific learning disability. According to IDEA, a specific learning disability is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, which may manifest in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. IDEA specifically names dyslexia as one example of a disorder that qualifies as a specific learning disability. Take a moment to pause this presentation and reflect on the following focus question. How does the language in IDEA align with or challenge your own prior understanding of how schools are intended to support students with dyslexia? Now that we've provided a basic understanding of special education law and key terminology within IDEA, let's take a look at how students with dyslexia are supported within IDEA and address some common misconceptions. Throughout, keep in mind that dyslexia is considered to be one type of specific learning disability, which is one of the 13 categories of disability acknowledged by IDEA. However, to be considered a student with a disability under IDEA and be eligible for special education services, it is not enough to be diagnosed with or identified as having dyslexia. A student must also demonstrate the need for special education. In other words, the student must be in need of specially designed instruction in order to be able to access general education and make educational progress. It is only students who meet the criteria for having a specific learning disability such as dyslexia and who are in need of special education that are eligible for special education services under IDEA. One common misconception is that having a dyslexia diagnosis automatically means that a student is eligible for special education services. For instance, it is often assumed that a student who has received a clinical diagnosis of dyslexia from an outside clinic should be able to receive special education from their school. Not all students with dyslexia will be eligible for special education services, just as not all students who receive special education in reading will have a dyslexia diagnosis. This is because a clinical diagnosis and a school special education eligibility operate under different criteria. Clinical diagnoses are obtained through outside clinics, and the primary purpose of these private evaluations is to obtain a dyslexia diagnosis. So, private evaluations generally focus on collecting data that tell the evaluator whether or not the student meets specific criteria that indicate they have dyslexia. For example, a private evaluation might involve a clinical or neuropsychologist conducting reading and cognitive tests with a student. The evaluator will then use guidelines from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, to decide whether or not the student has dyslexia. In schools, we don't officially diagnose students with disabilities, but instead identify students who are in need of special education. The main purpose of the evaluation process is to decide whether the student is in need of special education services to be able to access the general curriculum and make progress. In other words, students who are eligible for special education are identified as having specific learning disabilities, such as dyslexia, through the process. But to qualify for services, there also needs to be evidence that the student's academic needs aren't being met by general education. The student needs to demonstrate needs above and beyond what can be supported in the general education classroom, and above and beyond the needs of their general education peers. Further, unlike in medical clinics, schools are required to reevaluate students who are eligible for special education services every 3 years to determine whether they still can be identified as having a disability and that they still have educational need that requires special education. This means that a student with a dyslexia diagnosis may be eligible for special education in first grade, but may no longer be eligible at their 3-year reevaluation in fourth grade. Information on a student's educational need is typically gathered through classroom observations, a review of student records, and parent and teacher interviews. Understood.org has a helpful table that describes key differences between school identification and a clinical diagnosis of learning disabilities such as dyslexia. We also know that dyslexia exists on a continuum from less to more severe, and that students who are diagnosed with dyslexia may demonstrate a range of reading skills. Students with more mild forms of dyslexia may not need special education supports if their difficulties are specific to word-level reading skills that can be addressed through general education, such as Supplemental Tier 2 intervention. Other students who have more severe forms of dyslexia will likely end up needing special education because their more substantial difficulties with word reading, and potentially with comprehension and vocabulary, are being exacerbated by cognitive processes such as processing speed, working memory, or attention, and the intensity of supports that can be provided in general education may not be sufficient to help them make progress. Let's consider an example of a first-grade student who has received a dyslexia diagnosis from her pediatrician. This student is screened as at risk on a fall reading screener, and so is assigned to receive Tier 2 reading intervention to target her difficulties with decoding skills. After 6 weeks of intervention, progress monitoring data demonstrates that this student is making reading gains similar to other students in her Tier 2 reading group, and that she is on track to be reading at grade level by the end of the school year. This student would not qualify for special education because her reading needs are being met through the general education setting. In other words, the instruction the student is receiving is appropriate according to IDEA, because the Tier 2 supports are helping her make progress to a similar degree to her general education peers and toward grade level standards. Another common misconception is that special education is intended to provide the best education possible to all students, including students with dyslexia. For instance, it is sometimes assumed that if a student has dyslexia, they are entitled to services that will help them excel to reach their maximum potential, which may look like reading above grade level or accessing accelerated curriculum. As specified in IDEA, schools are required to provide students with disabilities with a free, appropriate public education, and the Supreme Court has clarified that an appropriate education is one that enables these students to achieve passing marks and advance from grade to grade. Specially designed instruction is provided to students with disabilities who need these services in order to be able to access the general education curriculum. In other words, schools are required to provide services that will allow students to make progress toward grade level standards, but not necessarily to exceed these standards. As an example, consider a second grade student who has been diagnosed with dyslexia and who is reading at the 35th percentile on a literacy screening assessment and receiving passing grades. The 35th percentile is considered to be in the average range compared to grade level peers, and this student is demonstrating that she is able to keep up with the general curriculum. Though this student is not excelling above and beyond her peers, and though she may be capable of stronger reading performance, this student will likely not be eligible for special education services in reading, because she is making progress comparable to her peers and is on track for grade-level reading skills. Take a moment to pause this presentation and reflect on the misconceptions that we have talked about so far: that a dyslexia diagnosis warrants special education, and that special education is intended to provide the best education possible. How does the information presented so far align with your previous understanding of how students with dyslexia are served in schools and in special education? What additional questions does this information bring up for you? Another common misconception is that students with reading difficulties due to dyslexia won't get the supports they need unless they qualify for special education. This is one reason why many parents and educators have pushed for special education, because they think it is the only way to ensure their students' reading needs are met. In fact, the needs of most students with reading difficulties can and should be met through general education supports. Schools with strong, multi-tiered systems of support in reading, or MTSS, are able to ensure that the reading needs of all students are met in a timely fashion, whether or not they receive special education. Within MTSS, students are provided reading services through a continuum of supports. Most students, around 80%, get their reading needs met at Tier 1 in core instruction, while students with greater needs are provided increasingly intensive supports in Tiers 2 and 3, supplemental or intensive intervention. Valid and reliable data are collected while students receive instruction and intervention supports to determine whether instruction is working as intended to help students make reading progress, or whether instruction needs to be intensified to help accelerate students' rate of learning. This continuum of supports ensures that all students receive instruction aligned with their level of need from day one, while also not overtaxing the school's limited resources. A continuum of supports also allows for flexible movement between tiers of instruction, so that students don't get stuck with a level of support that isn't appropriate for them. For instance, as data demonstrates that a student's needs grow more intensive, the student's intervention can be intensified. At the same time, if data show that a student is catching up to their grade-level peers and is no longer in need of intensive instructional supports, these supports can be gradually faded. Within multi-tiered systems of support, special education is just the next step in the continuum. Special education is considered for a student after all resources have been exhausted in general education, and it is clear that the student's reading needs are so profound that they can only be met through highly intensive and individualized reading supports. Since dyslexia falls on a continuum, the needs of students with dyslexia will vary widely. Some of these students will need the most intensive individualized reading supports in a special education setting in order to make progress, while others will need just a few accommodations in the general education classroom. MTSS provides a systematic way of determining what each student needs as soon as they enter formal schooling, rather than waiting to provide a student with supports only once their needs become so intensive that they require special education. The power of supplemental interventions provided in the context of MTSS for supporting students with reading difficulties is well documented in research. For example, Burns and colleagues conducted a study where they examined the reading growth of second and third grade students who scored below the 10th percentile on a fall reading screener. Some of these students received a targeted Tier 2 intervention for 20 minutes per day, 4 days a week, for up to 18 weeks. Another group of these students did not receive Tier 2 intervention, but received specially designed instruction through special education. The researchers found that students who received the Tier 2 intervention made reading growth at a rate that was significantly higher than the students who received special education. They also found that the students receiving Tier 2 intervention made improvements at a rate that was comparable to their Tier 1 peers who did not have any demonstrated reading difficulties. In other words, high-quality Tier 2 reading interventions provided with MTSS can be just as, if not more effective than special education services for students with substantial reading difficulties. And these services can be provided right from the start of the school year, with no need for a comprehensive special education evaluation. Here is one example of how a school's MTSS framework could provide a continuum of instructional supports to students with or at risk for dyslexia. A beginning-of-year dyslexia screener will differentiate between students with and without dyslexia risk, and assign those students at risk for dyslexia to an evidence-based Tier 2 intervention. Students in Tier 2 receive ongoing progress monitoring, and a progress check in mid-fall determines whether students are making adequate progress. Students making good progress either continue in Tier 2 or return to Tier 1, and students making inadequate progress receive more intensified Tier 2 or are moved into Tier 3 intervention. This process continues across the year, and the instruction is gradually intensified for students who are not making adequate progress. By the end of the year, as long as students are receiving high-quality instructional supports, only a few students should continue to demonstrate inadequate progress to the extent that they are referred for a special education evaluation and are determined to be in need of special education supports. Another common misconception is that interventions that work for students with dyslexia are different than effective interventions for students with reading risk in the early grades. When considering an intervention for any student, it's important to consider both how content is taught and what content is taught. Decades of research make clear that how we teach students who are struggling to grasp any concept is the same. And for students who are struggling to read in the early grades, what we teach is likely also going to be similar, whether or not the student has been diagnosed with dyslexia. We know that the most effective way to teach struggling readers, no matter their reading deficits, is through explicit and systematic instructional methods. And we know that in the early grades, the majority of students with reading difficulties are struggling to read words. This means that in general, we can assign students to supplemental reading interventions based on screening assessments that document students' early literacy skills. And most students diagnosed with dyslexia will benefit from these supports, right along with other students with reading risk. Interventions for students struggling to read in K-2 will be most effective when they use explicit and systematic instructional principles. Explicit instruction means instruction that is stated clearly and in detail, leaving no room for confusion or doubt. Instruction that is explicit will include highly focused and purposeful use of instructional language. For instance, it will include clear and concise teacher explanations of lesson objectives and teacher models. Explicit instruction will also include strategies to improve on student engagement, such as opportunities for student practice and checks for understanding, as well as immediate and specific correction of student errors. Systematic instruction means that there is a clear system, method, or plan around which content is taught. This includes utilization of a scope and sequence, where earlier skills build on later skills, easier skills are taught before more challenging skills, and strategic scaffolding and review are built into instruction. The most common roadblock to reading proficiency in the early grades is word reading skills, and so the most effective intervention for students struggling to read in K-2 will likely target their decoding skills. This may include instruction in phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition, sight word knowledge, and accuracy and fluency with connected text. The Institute for Education Science Practice Guide on Foundational Skills to Support Reading for Understanding in Kindergarten through 3rd Grade is a great resource that summarizes the research around different strategies for teaching students decoding skills, and provides helpful activities and resources educators can use to help them effectively teach students with reading difficulties, including dyslexia. We know that for a few students with reading difficulties, whether or not they have a dyslexia diagnosis, Tier 2 intervention alone won't be sufficient to meet their needs. For these students, we can use the same process to intensify interventions using data to help determine students' individual needs. For instance, whether or not a student has a dyslexia diagnosis, if they are inadequately responding to Tier 2 intervention, strategically utilizing these research-based intensification strategies can help to improve student outcomes. Resources like this Taxonomy of Intervention Intensity Checklist from the National Center on Intensive Interventions can be a helpful tool for supporting educators with intensifying interventions for students with reading difficulties such as dyslexia, who demonstrate the need for more intensive supports. Let's take a look at how this might look in practice. In this example, 2 first-grade students are screened in the fall for reading risk on measures of phonemic awareness and decoding skills. These 2 students are flagged for risk on both tests. One of the students has had no formal reading experience prior to 1st grade, and the other student received reading supports in kindergarten and has been diagnosed with dyslexia by an outside clinic. Because both students demonstrated a similar pattern of reading needs, they are both assigned to a daily Tier 2 reading intervention that focuses on teaching the reading skills they are struggling with, phonemic awareness and phonics, in an explicit and systematic fashion. Progress data is also collected for both students, which indicates that the Tier 2 intervention is resulting in similar improvements in phonemic awareness and decoding skills. If either of these students had demonstrated inadequate progress in their Tier 2 intervention, the teacher would follow the same steps to determine how to intensify intervention for the student. For example, the interventionist would look across data sources, such as student mastery data, a more in-depth assessment of the student's skill gaps in phonemic awareness or phonics, or a consideration of student behavior, and adjust the student's intervention using evidence-based intensification strategies. The bottom line is, regardless of the underlying causes of these students' reading difficulties, their reading skill deficits are the same. So, we will support these students through the same evidence-based interventions, and will use data on their progress to make evidence-based adjustments to instruction, based on student need. It is likely that neither of these students will be eligible for special education services, even with a diagnosed disability, if the level of support needed to support student progress toward grade-level objectives can continue to be provided in general education. The final misconception that we'll discuss today is that an assessment of a student's cognitive skills is necessary to determine eligibility for a specific learning disability such as dyslexia. While many states and schools do use cognitive assessments as part of a comprehensive evaluation process, IDEA does not require their use. This misconception most likely stems from a key phrase that can be found in most dyslexia definitions, that students with dyslexia demonstrate unexpected reading difficulties in relation to their cognitive abilities. One approach, then, to evaluating students for specific learning disabilities such as dyslexia in schools is to administer a combination of cognitive and academic assessments to students and examine results for a discrepancy in scores. If a student demonstrates high cognitive abilities but low achievement, the child may be eligible for special education through the IQ Achievement Discrepancy Model. A similar approach examines these assessments for a pattern of cognitive strengths and weaknesses paired with low reading achievement, providing evidence of unexpected underachievement. This approach is commonly called a pattern of processing strengths and weaknesses, or PSW, approach. However, according to IDEA, while schools may use the IQ achievement model, or a pattern of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, as part of an evaluation for specific learning disabilities such as dyslexia, they cannot require this approach. IDEA also offers another approach to evaluation for specific learning disabilities such as dyslexia that states must allow, a process based on the student's response to scientific, research-based intervention, which is most commonly known as response to intervention, or RTI. IDEA requires schools to answer 3 primary questions when identifying students with a specific learning disability, such as dyslexia, using an RTI approach. First, it must be determined if the student has adequately responded to generally effective intervention. IDEA defines inadequate progress as a student not making sufficient progress to meet age or grade level standards when provided with scientific, research-based intervention. To answer this question, a school may examine a student's progress monitoring data, as well as intervention implementation data, to determine whether the student is demonstrating a persistently poor response to high-quality intervention. Second, it must be determined whether the student has educational need. IDEA defines educational need as inadequate achievement for a student's age or inadequate achievement as compared to grade-level reading standards. To answer this question, a school may collect data on the student's word reading and spelling skills to determine whether the student demonstrates low reading achievement relative to grade-level standards or typically developing peers. And finally, it must be determined whether there are exclusionary factors that can better explain the student's reading difficulties than a specific learning disability. These exclusionary factors include things like other disabilities, any environmental, cultural, or linguistic factors, and lack of appropriate instruction. An RTI approach to determining eligibility for specific learning disabilities such as dyslexia fits well within a school's MTSS framework. For instance, within MTSS, a student who is screened as at risk for reading difficulties such as dyslexia at the beginning of the school year will be assigned to receive evidence-based supplemental interventions. Then, throughout the year, student data will be collected to monitor progress toward grade-level reading standards and to make adjustments to instruction. Implementation data will also be collected to ensure that instruction is being implemented as intended. By the time the student has demonstrated pervasive reading difficulties to the extent that a special education evaluation is initiated, there is ample evidence to demonstrate that the student has educational need and has not responded adequately to instruction. These data are hugely important for making decisions about whether the student is in need of special education. At the same time, this student will have received high-quality interventions targeting their individual needs before ever setting foot in special education. The Texas Center for Learning Disabilities provides an overview of how schools can evaluate specific learning disabilities such as dyslexia within MTSS. We hope this presentation has provided you with an understanding of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and its intended purposes, helped you understand key terminology used in IDEA, and helped you learn more about key misconceptions around how schools and special education are intended to support students with dyslexia. Before we end, take a moment to pause this presentation and think about 1 to 2 key takeaways that resonated with you today. Based on this information, what is one action step that you will take to support your child or student with dyslexia at school, through general or special education? You can find more information about the content in this presentation at these links. The National Center on Improving Literacy also has a variety of resources for supporting the needs of students with reading disabilities, including dyslexia. You can access our website at this link. Thanks so much for listening.